The first time Wallace Quinn saw Opal Callahan, she was pulling a rusted wagon wheel out of the mud by herself, her jaw set like stone and her green eyes blazing with a fury that could have stopped a stampede cold. It was the spring of 1874, and the territory of New Mexico was still young enough to be dangerous, still raw enough that the earth itself seemed to resist the people who tried to claim it. The town of Seco Hollow sat in a shallow valley between two ridgelines, a dusty arrangement of wooden storefronts and canvas-covered wagons that had decided to stop moving and become something more permanent. The general store, the assay office, the livery stable, and a saloon called the Bent Spur were the bones of the place, held together by mud in the rainy season and cracking heat in the summer. Seco Hollow had been a cattle stop first, then a mining town when silver was rumored in the ridges, and now it was simply a town, full of the usual mixture of ambition and desperation that the American West attracted like a flame drew moths. Wallace Quinn rode into it on a gray April morning with a mule named Conrad, a canvas bedroll, and the last of a modest inheritance that his father had left him back in Tennessee. He was 28 years old, broad across the shoulders from years of farm labor, with sun-darkened skin and dark brown eyes that tended toward quiet observation before speech. He had come west because the East had stopped feeling like possibility and had started feeling like a ceiling pressing down. He had heard there was land to be had in New Mexico, real land, acreage that a man could work and shape into something that would outlast him. That was what he wanted. Not gold, not quick fortune. Just ground that was his, and something to build on it. He had stopped at the edge of town to water Conrad at the trough near the livery when he noticed the commotion at the far end of the main street. A supply wagon had sunk its rear wheel into a mud hole that the night's rain had opened up in the road, and the wagon's owner was in the process of dealing with it alone. He watched for a moment before he understood that the owner was a woman, young, perhaps 24 or 25, with dark auburn hair pinned up under a practical hat, and a set of worn leather gloves that she was using to get a grip on the wheel's iron rim. She had her boots planted in the mud, her back bent, and she was heaving with everything she had. The wheel was not moving. Wallace tied Conrad to the trough post and walked down the street. He did not rush. He was a man who had learned that rushing into another person's trouble without invitation often made things worse. He stopped a respectful distance from her and cleared his throat. "Pardon me," he said. "Looks like you could use a second pair of hands." She looked up at him with those green eyes, and the expression in them was not gratitude or relief. It was assessment. She looked at him the way a woman looks at a man when she has been let down by enough of them to require evidence before trust. "I had it," she said. "Yes, ma'am," he agreed, even though she clearly had not had it. "But if you would not mind the help anyway, I am fairly good at mud." Something shifted in her expression. Not softness exactly, but the small relaxation of a jaw that had been held tight for a long time. She stepped back and gestured at the wheel with one gloved hand. "Then be my guest, Mr. Quinn," he said. "Wallace Quinn." "Opal Callahan," she said, and did not offer her hand because both of hers were covered in mud. He got his boots in the mire and his hands on the wheel, and he pulled. He was stronger than he looked, or perhaps it was that he knew where to put the effort, not against the wheel's resistance but into the ground beneath it, working the thing sideways an inch at a time until the suction broke and the wagon lurched free. The mule hitched to her wagon through its head, and she was already at the animal's bridle, steadying it with a low, firm voice before the creature could bolt. "Easy now, Duchess," she murmured, and the mule calmed because she had that kind of voice when she chose to use it. Wallace stood in the road with mud to his knees and felt, in a way he could not have explained to anyone, that something significant had just happened to him. Not because she was beautiful, though she was, in the particular way of women who do not think much about their beauty because they are too busy thinking about everything else, but because of the steadiness in her, the competence, the way she had been losing and had still kept her grip. "Thank you," she said, without looking at him again. She climbed up onto the wagon seat and clicked to the mule and drove on. He stood there and watched her go, and he was already, without knowing it, in a great deal of trouble. He found out about her in the way you find out about people in small towns, which is to say that the information came to him, whether he asked for it or not. He took a room above the general store owned by a man named Archie Briggs, who had opinions about everything and the inclination to share them without prompting. Over the course of his first week in Seco Hollow, Wallace learned that Opal Callahan had come west 2 years prior with her father, Bernard Callahan, who had purchased a 40-acre parcel of land 3 miles east of town with the intention of running cattle. Bernard Callahan had lasted 1 winter. His heart had given out in February of 1873, and he had left his daughter alone on a piece of land that still had a half-built fence, a small adobe house that leaked in 3 places, and a debt to the Territorial Bank that Opal Callahan had been paying down, month by careful month, ever since. She ran a few head of cattle. She grew a kitchen garden. She sold eggs and vegetables at the Saturday market in town, and occasionally took in mending or laundry when the cattle market was thin. She had no family within 500 miles. She had refused 3 marriage proposals since her father's death, which the people of Seco Hollow considered either admirable or foolish, depending on who you asked. Archie Briggs thought it was foolish. "A woman alone out here," he said one evening, leaning on his counter and shaking his head. "It is not sensible, Mr. Quinn. The territory is too hard and too far from anything civilized. She needs someone." "Perhaps she disagrees," Wallace said mildly. Briggs shrugged. "She can disagree all she wants. That does not change the facts of the land." Wallace thought about that for a long time after he went upstairs. He thought about what it meant to need someone, and whether needing was the same as wanting, and whether a person who had learned to survive without help might eventually forget what help even felt like. He went to look at land the following Monday. He had identified a parcel about a mile south of Opal Callahan's property, 60 acres of decent pasture with a creek running through the north edge, and a natural windbreak of cottonwood trees along the western side. The land agent, a red-faced man named Hollis Pratt, told him the soil was good for grazing and passable for crops if he was willing to put in the irrigation work. Wallace stood on the highest point of the land and looked out over the valley and the distant purpled ridges, and he thought, "Yes, this is where I stop." He put the money down that afternoon. He did not see Opal Callahan again for 3 weeks. He was busy during those weeks, setting up a temporary camp on his new land, hiring 2 local men to help him begin breaking ground, and making the necessary trips to town for supplies and equipment. He was building, first in his head and then with his hands, the shape of the life he intended. He thought about her in the spaces between work, which surprised him, because he was not generally a man given to distraction. But the image of her in the mud, pulling that wheel with everything she had, did not leave him easily. When he did see her again, it was at the Saturday market. She had a table with a canvas shade, and on it were arranged a careful display of eggs, 3 types of vegetables, and 2 jars of honey that she apparently kept bees for as well. She was making change for an elderly Mexican woman and explaining something about the honey in careful, deliberate Spanish, and Wallace stopped walking without meaning to, because he had not known she spoke Spanish, and it struck him, the way that an unexpected quality in a person can strike you, like a door opening onto a room you had not known was there. She looked up when the woman left and saw him standing there. She had the look of a woman who knows she has been watched and is deciding how to feel about it. "Mr. Quinn," she said. "Miss Callahan," he said. "How is the wagon holding up?" "The wheel held," she said. "I had a man in town put a new iron band on it last week." "Smart," he said. "You have good honey here." He had not touched the jars or looked at them closely, so she knew he was making conversation, not a purchase inquiry, and the slight lift at the corner of her mouth told him she knew it too. "Are you buying anything or just visiting?" she asked. "Both, if that is acceptable," he said, and bought a jar of honey and a dozen eggs, and learned that her bees were Italian honeybees she had ordered from a supplier in Texas, and that she had started with 2 hives and now had 5. and that the honey from the second hive tasted different from the others because of a particular wildflower that grew near the creek on the north side of her property. He listened to all of this, and he thought he had never in his life been so interested in bees. He came back the next Saturday and the Saturday after that. He did not press. He was not by nature a pressing kind of man. He asked questions and he listened to the answers, and he told her things about himself when she asked, which she began to do after the third Saturday, carefully, the way a person tests ice before putting their full weight on it. He told her about Tennessee, and about his father's farm, and about the long road west, and about what he was hoping to build on his 60 acres south of her property. He watched her face when he talked about building, and something happened in her expression that he could not entirely read, something complicated, like a person who wants a thing, and has decided it is too costly to want. She came to his land once in that early period, not to visit him, but because the creek that ran through his northern acreage was connected to the same waterway that bordered her eastern fence, and there had been a question about water rights, and she wanted to see the surveyor's marks for herself. He was out working when she rode up on a spotted pony that was clearly better at its job than most horses he had seen, and she dismounted and walked the creek bank with the purposefulness of a woman who had learned to be her own legal counsel, because there was no one else to be it for her. He walked beside her and answered her questions about the survey stakes, and she was satisfied that the water allocation was fair, and she said so, which he suspected she would not have bothered to say if she had not respected him enough to bother. They stood at the creek's edge in the afternoon light, the water moving quick and cold over the stones, and she bent and cupped some water in her palm and let it run between her fingers. "This is good land," she said. "I think so too," he said. "What will you build?" She asked. She was looking at the water, not at him. "I have a plan for a house," he said. "Stone foundation, 2 rooms to start with the intention to add more as makes sense. A good barn first, because the animals need to be settled before a man does. That is what my father taught me." She was quiet for a moment. "He sounds like a practical man." He was, Wallace said. He was also sentimental about things he never admitted to being sentimental about. He planted rose bushes along the front of the farmhouse back home every spring, claimed it was his wife's preference, but she had been gone 10 years by the time he stopped planting them. He had not meant to tell her that. It came out of him sideways, the way some truths do. He felt slightly exposed, the way you feel when you have revealed something you did not plan to reveal and now must simply stand there and let it sit between you. She looked at him then. Those green eyes were level and direct, and there was something in them that was not pity but was perhaps recognition, the look of a person who has known loss and can identify it in someone else the way a doctor identifies an old healed break in a bone. "That is not a bad thing," she said quietly. "Sentimental about the right things." She rode away shortly after, and he stood at the creek for a long time watching the water go. He began the barn first, as he had said he would. He hired a carpenter named Ed Foley from town, a lean, efficient man in his 50s who chewed tobacco and spoke very little but built with a precision that Wallace respected. They worked together through May and into June, and the barn rose plank by plank on the southwest corner of the property, a solid and handsome structure that drew a few comments from the ranchers who rode past on the road. Wallace was good with his hands, and he worked alongside Foley every day, not standing back and directing, but putting his own labor into every board. He began to buy cattle in small lots, choosing carefully, 4 cows and a bull to start, then 6 more cows in July when a rancher to the north was selling off part of his herd. He learned the land as you can only learn land by walking it in every season, by watching where the water pooled after rain, and where the grass grew thickest, and where the soil went thin and rocky. He was not a man who rushed conclusions. He gathered information slowly and made decisions he intended to keep. It was Opal who told him, in their 7th or 8th Saturday conversation, that there was a stretch of bad fence on the south boundary of her property that the bank would not lend against because the loan officer considered it insufficient collateral for improvement work. She said it in the clipped, factual way she had of discussing difficulties, as though she were reporting weather conditions rather than the particular grinding anxiety that Wallace recognized underneath her words. "What does the fence need?" he asked. "About 400 yards of new posts and wire," she said. "The old posts are rotted through at the base. Half of them are already down. I lost 2 cows last month when they wandered through the gap into the Terrero property, and Terrero charged me a fee for their recovery." She paused. "I can do the posts myself if I can afford the wire. The wire is the problem." "How much is the wire?" he asked. She told him a number that he could have provided in a week without hardship. He could see that she knew he was calculating this, and he could also see that she was braced against the offer she expected him to make, the way she would brace against any offer that felt like charity or obligation or something that came with conditions she had not agreed to. So he did not offer. "I know a man in Las Cruces who sells wire at wholesale," he said instead. "He is looking for someone to transport a load up this way and would take payment off the transport cost for the trouble. If you wanted, I could write you an introduction. You could deal with him directly." She looked at him with those calibrating eyes. "You would do that?" "I will send the letter tomorrow," he said. She bought the wire from the man in Las Cruces and she put in the posts herself, working through 2 weekends with a post driver that she borrowed from Ed Foley, and Wallace knew about it because Foley mentioned it to him, shaking his head with the particular admiration of a practical man for another practical person. "That woman works like 2 men, Foley said. "Yes," Wallace agreed. "She does." He had started to think by midsummer about the house. Not the house he would build for himself, though he thought about that too, but a house in the abstract, what a house meant, what it said about a person's intentions. A barn was a statement of purpose. A house was a statement of belonging. It said, "I am planting myself here, in this particular square of earth, and I intend to remain." His father had understood this. His father had built the Tennessee farmhouse with his own hands before he had proposed to Wallace's mother, because he had believed that a man who offered marriage should be able to offer more than words. He should be able to offer ground and walls and the evidence of his seriousness. Wallace had thought about this philosophy most of his life, turning it over the way you turn a stone in a river, examining every facet. He had agreed with it in principle. He had never before been in a position to act on it. He was in that position now. The question, the large and complicated question that occupied his evenings through July and into August, was whether acting on it would be welcome or whether it would be precisely the wrong thing, the thing that pushed Opal Callahan further behind the careful wall she had built around herself. She had refused 3 men. She had her land, her bees, her cattle, her own particular sovereignty. He was not sure she was looking for what he was thinking about offering. But he thought about the rose bushes his father planted every spring, and he thought about the creek and the cottonwood trees, and the way the afternoon light fell across the grass on his 60 acres, and he thought about her voice when she spoke Spanish to the elderly woman at the market, and he made a decision that he fully understood might end very badly for him. He would build the house. Not propose first and then build. Build first. Build with the kind of intention and care that could not be confused for anything casual. Build it and then let her see it, and let the house say what he was not sure he had the right to say with words, and then, if she wished, she could decide what it meant or did not mean. That was the only kind of offer he could make to a woman like Opal Callahan, not a demand and not a plea. A demonstration. He sat with Ed Foley in late August and drew out the plans on paper, working and reworking the design for 3 evenings until it was what he wanted. Stone foundation, as he had described to her at the creek. A kitchen that was actually a kitchen, with a proper iron range and counter space and a window facing east for morning light. A parlor with a fireplace built from the local reddish limestone that was everywhere in the ridges. 2 bedrooms. A wide front porch with a sloped roof that would handle the rain. A root cellar cut into the hillside behind the house. A garden space beside the east wall, fenced against deer, with soil he intended to work compost into before winter so it would be ready for planting in the spring. He had thought about what kind of garden she would want. He had paid attention. Vegetables, yes, but also flowers. She had mentioned once, when describing her property, that her father had brought a cutting of a climbing rose all the way from Missouri and planted it against the side of the adobe house, and that it had bloomed the summer before he died, and she had cried when she saw it because it was so incongruously lovely in that harsh landscape. Wallace had written to a nursery in El Paso about dormant rose cuttings. He intended to plant 3 varieties along the south-facing wall. He worked on the house through September and October, rising before dawn and working until dark, Foley beside him for the skilled carpentry and the stonework, and 2 young men named Cass and Domingo for the heavy labor. He did not tell anyone in town what the house was for. Foley did not ask. Cass and Domingo were not the kind of young men who asked questions when there was pay and work. Wallace went to the Saturday market and talked with Opal as he always did, and nothing in his manner changed because he had decided that he would not let it change, that she would not feel the weight of what he was doing before she saw it. He began to love her in the full sense of the word somewhere in October, though he suspected it had been growing since April like a plant that takes its time about showing above ground. He loved the way she kept her accounts in a leather-bound book that she carried in her coat pocket and checked against the prices at the market with the focus of a woman who could not afford errors. He loved the way she laughed, which was not often but was absolute when it happened, throwing her head back slightly and laughing with her whole chest like a person who does not do things halfway. He loved her stubbornness and her capability and the way she looked at the land, both his and hers, with the eyes of someone who understood that land was not property in the simple legal sense but was also relationship, was also responsibility. He also began to understand in October that she felt something for him. It was not declared. It was not even close to declared. But she had begun to watch for him at the market before he arrived, which Archie Briggs had mentioned with amusement and which Opal would have denied if asked. She had twice ridden past his property on the road to town when the shorter route would have taken her past the Terrero Ranch instead. And one afternoon when he had been working on the house and had cut his hand on a nail, she had appeared at the edge of his property on the spotted pony, Duchess, apparently returning from town, and had seen him wrapping his hand with a piece of cloth and had dismounted without invitation and produced a proper bandaging kit from her saddlebag and wrapped the cut with efficient, gentle hands that did not quite let go when the wrapping was done. They had stood there for a moment, her hands holding his bandaged hand, both of them aware of it. "You need to keep it dry," she said, in the voice of a woman telling herself something. "I will," he said. She let go and mounted Duchess and rode on, and he stood in the field holding his bandaged hand and understanding that they were both in a great deal of trouble. The house was finished in the first week of November. The rose cuttings had arrived from El Paso in October and were dormant in the ground along the south wall, wrapped in burlap against the coming cold. The garden soil was turned and composted. The root cellar was stocked with a modest beginning. The parlor fireplace drew cleanly and warmly. The kitchen range was installed and had been tested. The front porch faced west, and the evening light that fell across it in the last days of October was precisely the color that Wallace had imagined, that warm bronze light that turned the limestone walls gold. He stood in the finished house the morning after Foley declared it complete, alone, and looked at every room in turn, and he felt something that was equal parts satisfaction and terror. The satisfaction was the same thing he had felt completing every building project he had ever done, the particular pleasure of a thing built well with his own hands and standing solid. The terror was something else entirely. He had built a house for a woman who had not said yes. She had not even been asked yet. He needed to tell her about it. He had been wrestling with how for a week, and he had not resolved it to any clean answer. He could simply ask her to come and see. He could write her a note. He could tell her at the market. None of these felt adequate to what the house was saying, and he was not sure, in his honest moments, that any method of introduction would be adequate, because the house itself was the statement, and either she would understand it or she would not, and either she would want it or she would not, and there was nothing he could do about either outcome except hope. He decided to tell her on the following Saturday. But Saturday was 4 days away, and on Wednesday morning he looked out his camp tent. He had been staying in the tent while the house was finished, planning to move his things into the house properly once he had spoken to her, and saw Opal Callahan riding across his land toward the house. She had not known, he would learn later, that he had been building anything beyond the barn. The house sat on the northeastern quarter of his property, set back from the main road, screened by the cottonwood grove so that it was not visible from the road she usually took into town. But she had ridden a different way that morning, cutting across the higher ground to get a better look at the ridge where she suspected a section of her own fence had come down in the previous night's wind, and from the higher ground the house was suddenly and completely visible in the morning light, and she had stopped riding and stared at it for a long moment before she had begun moving toward it. Wallace was outside his tent when she arrived. He saw her coming and he set down his coffee cup and he waited, standing very still, the way a man stands when he has made a very large bet and the cards are about to be turned. She rode up to the front of the house and she dismounted and she stood there. She stood there for a very long time. The house was simple and handsome, its limestone walls pale gold in the morning sun, the front porch casting a clean shadow across the ground. The 3 rose bushes along the south wall were bare and brown in their winter dormancy, but their stakes and the trellis he had built for them were visible, neat and well constructed, promising something. The garden fence beside the east wall was straight and precise. The front door was solid oak, with iron hardware that he had special ordered from a smithy in Albuquerque. She put her hand against the limestone wall. She walked slowly along the front of the porch, trailing her fingers over the wood railing. She stepped up and opened the front door and went inside, and he could hear nothing from where he stood, only the wind in the cottonwood trees and the distant sound of his cattle moving in the south pasture. She was inside for a long time. When she came out, she stood on the porch and she looked at him, and her face was doing something very complicated. He had seen Opal Callahan be composed and competent and occasionally amused, and once, at the market, briefly but genuinely angry at a merchant who had shorted her a measure of flour. He had not seen her look the way she looked now, which was like a person standing at the edge of something very vast and not yet sure whether to step. He walked toward her. He stopped at the base of the porch steps. "I was going to tell you about it Saturday," he said. "I had a speech worked out." She looked at him. "Did you?" "I will forget it now," he said. "It was not a very good speech." "What did it say?" Her voice was quiet. He put his hand on the porch post and looked up at her. She was 3 steps above him, and the morning light was behind her, and she looked, in that moment, like something he had been walking toward for a very long time without knowing the direction. "It said that I am 32 days from having been in this town for 7 months," he said, "and that in those 7 months I have thought about you every single day. It said that I have built this house with the intention of it being the kind of house a family could live in and grow in, and that when I designed every room I was thinking of you, which I understand is a significant presumption on my part, and which you are fully entitled to reject. It said that I am not asking you to decide anything today, or tomorrow, or next week. I am asking you only to know that this is what I intended, and that whatever you decide, I will not stop being your neighbor or your friend or the man who helped you with your wagon wheel in April, because those things are not conditional on your answer." He paused. That is what the speech said. She was quiet for so long that he began to think he had misread everything. That the hand holding at the bandage had been nothing, that the market visits had been nothing, that he had built a house on a guess and the guess had been wrong. Then she said, "You planted roses." "Along the south wall," he said. "They will not bloom until June, most likely, but they will bloom." She sat down on the top step of the porch, which was not what he had expected. She sat down and she put her elbows on her knees and she looked out over his land and she was quiet, but it was a different kind of quiet than before. It was not the quiet of rejection. It was the quiet of a person who is thinking very hard and deserves the space to do so. He sat down on the lowest step, facing the other direction, giving her that space. The cottonwood trees whispered in the wind. A hawk made a long, slow circle over the south pasture and then dropped below the ridge. "My father built the adobe house himself," she said eventually. "He spent 6 months on it before he would let me see the inside. He said a man should build a thing completely before he shows it to someone he loves. I thought he was being stubborn and secretive, and it irritated me greatly at the time." She paused. "I understand it better now." Wallace said nothing. He waited. "3 men proposed to me," she said. 2 of them I had known less than a month. 1 of them I had known 4 months. None of them had ever asked me a question about my bees or my accounting, or what I thought about the water rights question, or anything that was about who I actually was. They wanted a wife. They were not specifically interested in me. Another pause. "I noticed that you were interested in me." "I am extremely interested in you," he said, and meant it in every possible sense. She let out a breath that was not quite a laugh but was not far from one. "I noticed that too," she said. "It made me nervous." "I am sorry," he said. "Do not be," she said. "It was a pleasant kind of nervous. I am not used to that." She looked down at her hands, which were resting on her knees, and then she looked out over the land again. "I am not going to say yes today," she said, and before his stomach could fully drop she continued, "because I think a decision this size deserves more than one morning, and because I have spent 2 years making every decision for myself, and I am not willing to abandon that practice just because my feelings are inconveniently involved." She turned and looked at him then over her shoulder, and those green eyes were clear and direct. "But I am also not going to say no. I want you to know that." He looked at her and he thought he might be the luckiest man in New Mexico. "That is enough," he said. "That is more than enough." She stood and brushed off her skirt and went down the steps past him and mounted Duchess. She looked down at him from the saddle with an expression he would spend a long time trying to name and eventually settle on as courage, the particular courage of a person deciding to take a risk they have been trained by experience to avoid. "I would like to come back and see it again," she said, "when you would not mind the company." "My door is open," he said. "It has an excellent iron handle." She looked at the door and then at him, and she smiled, which was different from her laugh, quieter and more interior, and then she rode away. He stood in front of his house and felt the November sun on his face, and he thought, this is how hope feels when it has not been refused. She came back the following Sunday. She came in the afternoon, not at dawn this time, and she brought a tin of ginger biscuits that she set on his kitchen counter without comment, and then walked through the house again, more slowly this time, looking at things she had been too overwhelmed to look at closely on her first visit. She ran her fingers over the kitchen counter, testing the smoothness of the wood. She opened the kitchen window and looked out at the eastern view and said, quietly, that the morning light would be very fine there. She stood in the parlor and looked at the fireplace and said the limestone was a good choice, that it held heat well. She looked at both bedrooms and said nothing, but she was in each for a long time. In the second bedroom, the smaller one, she turned and said, "Did you think about children?" He said, "Yes." She nodded, as though she had expected this answer, and she went back to the kitchen and they had tea, because he had bought a tin of tea at the market 2 Saturdays ago as if in anticipation, and they sat at his kitchen table and drank tea and talked about fences, specifically the fence she needed to repair on the north boundary of her property, and he offered labor and she accepted it, which was new, the acceptance. And he noticed it, and did not comment on it but filed it away in the part of himself that was watching how the ice was holding. He helped her with the north fence over 2 weekends in November. They worked side by side, him driving posts and her stringing wire with practiced efficiency, and they talked as they worked about the cattle market, about the winter coming, about the mining operation up in the ridges that was apparently going to change the regional economy if the silver proved out, about the territorial legislature, and whether New Mexico would become a state in their lifetimes. She had opinions about all of it. She also had facts, gathered from the newspaper she had delivered from Santa Fe every 2 weeks, which she read thoroughly and remembered precisely. He told her once that she had one of the better minds he had encountered. She looked at him sideways and said, "You say that as though it surprises you." "It does not surprise me," he said. "I am stating it as a fact." "Most men would not consider it a compliment," she said. "Most men," he said, "are fools." She laughed then, the full laugh, the one with her head back, and he thought he could listen to that sound every day for the rest of his life, and it would never be ordinary. December came in cold and sharp, and the first real snow fell on the 8th of the month, a clean 3 inches that made the valley look like something drawn with care on white paper. Wallace had moved into his house properly by then, his few possessions arranged in the rooms, his books on the shelf he had built beside the parlor fireplace, his spare boots by the door. It felt, for the first time in his life, like a home rather than a stopping place. He rode out to check on Opal 2 days after the snow because the road in front of her adobe house had drifted over in the night, and he was concerned about her cattle's water supply, which he knew depended on a trough that could freeze. He found her already out, breaking ice on the trough with a long-handled mallet, her breath making clouds in the cold air and her coat covered in snow from where she had apparently slipped against the fence post. She was swearing, quietly and with some creativity, which he had not heard from her before and which he found unexpectedly endearing. "Let me," he said, reaching for the mallet. "I have it," she said, which was true this time. The ice was already breaking. But she stepped aside and he finished the job and she stood beside him, and the steam rose from the newly exposed water, and the cattle came over with their slow bovine certainty to drink. "Your lip is bleeding," he said. "From the fall against the post." She put her finger to her lip and looked at the blood and sighed in a deeply weary way. He produced a clean handkerchief from his coat pocket and offered it, and she took it without the usual pause. They went inside because it was too cold to stand about, and she made coffee on the small adobe fireplace that served her kitchen, the kind of fireplace that was ancient in its design and effective in its purpose. The interior of her house was small and exactly arranged, everything in its place, with a particular organization that was clearly the product of a person who had made careful decisions about what to keep and what to release. There were a few things that spoke of her father: a leather-bound Bible on the windowsill, a framed photograph of a man with a broad face and kind eyes. There was a drawing on the wall near the door, a careful pencil sketch of a rosebush in bloom which he thought she must have done herself and which was quite good. "Did you draw that?" he asked. "My mother did," she said. "She died when I was 12. It was the only drawing she ever did that we kept." He stood before it and looked at it properly. The rose in the drawing was in full bloom, each petal described with precise, gentle lines. "She had a fine eye," he said. "She did," Opal said. "She could have studied art if the circumstances had been different. She was very gifted." She said this without self-pity, but there was something underneath it that he recognized, the sadness of knowing what a person might have been in a world that made different space for them. He understood it. His own mother had been a schoolteacher before marriage, and she had missed teaching every day of the years she did not do it. They drank coffee and the snow kept falling outside and the world contracted to the small warm room, and at some point the conversation stopped having to do with cattle or weather and simply became two people talking as though they had always talked, as though the morning could go on indefinitely and neither of them would mind. It was not until he stood to go, his coat back on and the door open and the cold air coming in, that she said, I have been thinking about what you said. On the porch. He stood still in the doorway. Take your time, he said. I meant that. I know you did, she said. That is part of what I have been thinking about. She did not say anything else, and he did not press her, and he rode home through the snow with a feeling in his chest that was larger than what the morning had seemed to contain. Christmas in Seco Hollow was a modest affair. The church, a small adobe building at the east end of the main street, held services on Christmas Eve. The Bent Spur Saloon, in a gesture towards seasonal goodwill, closed for the evening. Archie Briggs's store had a small display of ribbons and chocolates in the window. The town gathered in the way small communities gather, for the warmth of it, because the cold and the distance from anywhere else pressed people together. Wallace went to the Christmas Eve service. Opal was there with a few of the neighboring ranching families, sitting near the front with a composed and slightly formal air that he recognized as her public manner, the manner she wore in town when she was aware of being watched. He sat 3 rows behind her and watched the candlelight on her hair and thought about the first morning he had seen her and the 7 months since, and the house sitting empty on his land and the rose cuttings sleeping in the cold ground. After the service, in the churchyard where people lingered in their coats and boots, she found him and stood beside him, and they looked at the stars, which were extraordinary in the cold air, sharp and numerous in a way that made the sky feel close. "Merry Christmas, Mr. Quinn," she said. "Merry Christmas, Miss Callahan," he said. He paused, and then, because the stars and the cold and the fact that he was a man who eventually said the true thing made him, he said, "I hope next Christmas will find us," and then he stopped because he had almost overstepped, almost pressed, and he had promised himself he would not press. But she said quietly, "Go on." He looked at her. "I hope next Christmas will find us indoors together," he said, "in a house with a good fireplace and a good view and roses that have bloomed once already." She was quiet for a moment. The sound of horses and people moving through the churchyard was around them, the particular sound of community life, the sound of people belonging to a place. She turned to look at him, and in the starlight her face was very still and very certain in the way that faces are when a decision has finally arrived at its home. "Yes," she said, just that word, 1 syllable, but it was the largest thing he had ever heard. He looked at her and she looked at him, and the stars kept doing what stars do, which is simply to be there and to witness. "I would like to do this properly," he said, after a moment in which the words settled between them like something solid. "I have nothing worthy of your hand yet in terms of a ring, but I can—" "Wallace," she said, and it was the first time she had used his given name, and it stopped him as effectively as a hand on his chest. "Yes," he said. "There is a ring that was my mother's," she said. "My father kept it for me. It is in the Bible on my window-sill. I would like it to be that one if you do not mind." He looked at her and felt something move through him that had no name in any language he had ever spoken, something that was gratitude and joy and the particular overwhelming quality of being truly seen and truly chosen. "I do not mind," he said, "not even a little." They were married in March, when the ground was beginning to soften and the first green things were showing through the last of the winter. The ceremony was in the church on the main street, and it was simple and direct, and Opal wore a dress that she had made herself over the previous 2 months, a dark green wool that matched her eyes, which she had never done before, and which made 3 women in the front pew catch their breath when she walked in. She carried wildflowers from her own land, the first of the season, small and hardy and absolutely specific to the place they were choosing to belong to. Wallace stood at the front of the church in his best coat and watched her come down the aisle, and he thought that he would remember this for every remaining day of his life. The sight of her walking toward him through the candlelight with the flowers from her own land and her mother's ring in the Reverend's keeping and her green eyes on his face. The Reverend was a slow and thorough man named Fletcher who took the service seriously and did not rush it. Opal's voice was steady and clear when she said the words. Wallace's was the same. Outside, through the church's small windows, the March wind moved across the valley. The Briggses had arranged a small celebration in the general store after, clearing the floor and pushing back the shelves, and about 30 people from Seco Hollow and the surrounding ranches crowded in. Ed Foley brought a fiddle he had not mentioned he owned and played with a surprising lightness for a man of such efficient manners. There was cake and there was whiskey for the men, and there was a great deal of talking and laughing, and at one point Opal danced with Wallace in the cleared space, and he was a mediocre dancer, and she was surprisingly good, and she laughed at him with her whole chest when he stepped wrong and then put his hand around her waist and kept the beat for him, leading in the way she did most things, with quiet and certain competence. They moved her things from the adobe house to the limestone house the following week, which was not a great quantity of things but which were chosen and arranged with the same care she brought to everything. Her bees were relocated in their hives to a spot near the cottonwood grove, which she determined was optimal for their foraging patterns. The Bible went on the shelf beside his books in the parlor. Her mother's drawing of the rose hung in the kitchen, where the morning light hit it precisely at the angle it deserved. She sold a portion of her cattle, consolidating the two herds into one operation, and they discussed over the kitchen table the logic of the combined property, 40 and 60 acres becoming 100 acres together, which made them one of the more substantial cattle operations in the valley. She kept her accounts in the same leather-bound book and shared them with him as an equal, which was not how most ranching marriages of that era operated, and which he considered entirely correct and said so, and which made her look at him with the expression he had now catalogued as her trust face, the expression she wore when she was allowing herself to believe that something reliable was in front of her. The roses bloomed in June, precisely as he had predicted. The 3 bushes along the south wall came in with a suddenness and generosity that startled both of them, the first blooms appearing one morning, and by the following week the wall was covered in flowers, deep red and soft pink, and a pale cream variety that was almost white, filling the whole south side of the house with color and scent. Opal stood at the kitchen window and looked at them for a long time, and when she turned away her eyes were bright in a way she would not have allowed in front of anyone else. "Your father's rose bushes," she said. "He would have liked these," Wallace said. "He would have pretended he was indifferent and then talked about them to everyone he met." She laughed and took his hand, and they went outside into the June morning and stood in front of the roses, and the scent was extraordinary in the warm air, and it was the first summer of what would become a very long and very good story. The summer brought its own complications, as summers in the territory always did. There was a dispute over water access that involved 3 ranchers south of town, which Opal navigated with the same combination of clear-eyed legal reading and firm, unbothered patience that she brought to every problem. The silver mine up in the ridges brought more people into Seco Hollow, which meant more commerce but also more noise and disorder, and the territorial sheriff's presence in town increased as a result. There was a stretch of dry weather in August that worried everyone's pasture, and Wallace spent 2 weeks improving his irrigation from the creek with a system he designed himself, and that drew some impressed comment from neighboring ranchers. He also, in that summer, encountered for the first time the edge of something he had only understood in the abstract before. Opal had a friend in town, a woman named Consuela Montoya, whose family had been in the territory since before any American authority had claimed the land. Consuela's father had lost 3 parcels of land to legal maneuvers that had been designed to strip old Spanish and Mexican land grant holders of their property, a process that was happening across New Mexico in those years, with a thoroughness and injustice that the Anglo settlers who benefited from it rarely examined carefully. Consuela herself had been born to what should have been a comfortable inheritance, and had instead grown up in modest circumstances, because the courts had proved unwilling to honor her family's original grants. Opal knew this history and spoke about it with a directness that Wallace had not previously heard from anyone on the subject, though he had understood enough to know it was true. He listened, and he agreed, and he felt the particular discomfort of a man who has arrived in a place and taken land under laws that were not designed with fairness as their primary object. He could not undo his purchase, and the 60 acres were his under the current law, and Consuela's family's situation was not directly connected to his land, but the knowledge sat with him and shaped the way he dealt with his neighbors going forward, particularly his Mexican and Pueblo neighbors, with a deliberate attention to fairness and courtesy that Opal noticed and appreciated without needing to say she appreciated it. He helped 2 neighboring families in that summer with irrigation and fence work, asking nothing in return, and when a family passing through on their way north ran out of money and food at the edge of town, he and Opal provided them with 2 weeks of provisions from their root cellar and a lead on work in the area. These were not grand gestures. They were the ordinary decisions of people who understood that the land's harshness was not partial, that it fell on everyone equally, and that the only sensible response was to acknowledge the shared difficulty. By the end of their first summer together, Seco Hollow had begun to think of the Quinns as a certain kind of people. Not rich, not powerful, but reliable in the specific way that matters on a frontier. The kind of neighbors you could count on when counting on someone was the difference between staying and being beaten. In the autumn, Opal told him she was pregnant. She told him in the kitchen one morning over coffee, with the same direct, factual manner she used to report on the cattle numbers or the fence inventory, and he sat across from her and felt the world shift on its axis in the best possible direction. "Are you well?" he asked first, because this was the question that mattered most. "I am very well," she said. "I went to see the doctor in town last week. He says everything appears normal and he sees no reason for concern." He reached across the table and covered her hand with his. She turned her hand over and gripped his, which was how she showed most of what she felt, not in words but in grip. "A child," he said. "A child," she confirmed. "In the spring, the doctor thinks, perhaps April." He thought about April. He thought about the first April he had been in Seco Hollow, the mud and the wagon wheel and the green eyes. He thought about a year of Aprils stretching forward, each one different, and the house growing around them as a house does when people truly live in it. "I would like to add a room," he said. She looked at him with a slight, precise smile. "I thought you might say that. I have been thinking about the east side," he said. "There is room for an addition that would not compromise the kitchen window." "I know," she said. "I have been thinking about it too." She produced a piece of paper from her coat pocket and unfolded it on the table, and on it was a rough but accurate sketch of the house's floor plan with an addition drawn in precise pencil lines on the east side. He looked at it and then at her, and she said, "I drew it last week when I was waiting at the doctor's office. I was going to show you after I told you." He loved her so completely in that moment that he could not quite contain it, and he said, "Opal," in a way that was nothing but her name, and she looked at him and she understood what it contained. "I know," she said quietly. "I know." The winter of 1875 was the longest and coldest the region had seen in a decade. The snow came in November and did not fully leave until late February. Wallace and Ed Foley worked the addition to the house in the cold months, which was slower going than summer building but not impossible, and the room was framed and roofed before January was out and plastered and trimmed in February. Opal, who was large with the pregnancy by January and moving with the careful deliberateness of a woman who trusts her body but is not foolish about it, supervised the interior, finishing from her chair by the parlor fire, and had specific opinions about the height of the window in the new room and the direction it should face, and she was correct about both. The baby came in late March, not April as the doctor had estimated, arriving on a cold Tuesday morning after a night that Wallace spent mostly outside the bedroom door, because Opal had said she would call him if she needed him, and she had a woman from town with her, a Mexican midwife named Senora Vargas, who had delivered half the babies in the valley, and who had indicated through tone, rather than words, that husbands were most useful when they were elsewhere. He paced the front porch in the pre-dawn dark, and listened to the wind and the distant cattle and the occasional murmur of voices from inside. The sky was beginning to lighten in the east when he heard the first cry, thin and ferocious, and immediately the most important sound he had ever heard. Senora Vargas opened the bedroom door and looked at him with the calm of a woman for whom this was Tuesday. "A boy," she said. "They are both well. You may come in." The baby was red-faced and furious-looking, and about the size and weight of a substantial cabbage, and he was lying on Opal's chest with his tiny fist pressed against her collarbone, and his eyes squeezed shut with the force of recent arrival. Opal looked exhausted and certain, and more entirely herself than Wallace had ever seen her look, which he had not thought possible. He sat on the edge of the bed, and she shifted the baby slightly, and he looked at his son, which was a sentence he had never thought in his own head before and which rearranged everything it touched. "He looks like he is annoyed about being here," Wallace said. "He will get over it," Opal said. "We all do." They named him Bernard after her father, which had been Opal's suggestion, and which Wallace had agreed to immediately and genuinely. Bernard Wallace Quinn came into the world in late March of 1875, and he was loud and opinionated and healthy, and he looked in his first weeks like something between a very old man and a red turnip, and by his second month he was the most beautiful thing either of his parents had ever seen, which is the standard trajectory of babies, and which did not make it any less true in this case. The spring that year was particularly fine. The roses along the south wall bloomed early, and the kitchen garden that Opal had planted the previous fall was coming up with an abundance that she had not quite anticipated, and which required the addition of 2 new beds along the fence. The bees in the cottonwood grove were productive. The cattle had come through the winter well. Wallace had added a second bull and was beginning the careful process of building a genuinely good breeding herd, the kind that would take 5 years to realize its potential, but that he could already see the shape of. Bernard grew in the new east room, which turned out to have precisely the right window light, bright in the morning when he needed it and cool in the afternoon when he slept. Opal nursed him and managed the household accounts, and walked the property with him bundled against her in a sling she had made from heavy cloth, showing him the cattle and the garden and the bees with the matter-of-fact narration of a woman who was introducing him to his inheritance from the first days. She was magnificent with him, not soft in any sentimental way but warm in the deeper and more sustaining way, the way that knows what a child needs even before the child can express it. Wallace watched her with Bernard on a warm May evening, sitting on the front porch in the wooden chair he had made for her during the winter, the baby in the crook of her arm and the roses in bloom along the south wall and the last light going gold across the valley. And he felt the kind of happiness that is not excitement or elation but something quieter and more certain, like a foundation stone set level and true, like a creek running clear. He sat beside her on the porch and she leaned against him without rearranging Bernard, and he put his arm around her and the 3 of them watched the evening come. "I have been thinking," Opal said. "About what?" he asked. "About the north pasture," she said. "I think we could run 12 more head next season if we improve the water access by another 50 yards. He looked down at the top of her head. "You are sitting here with our son in your arms watching the sunset, and you are thinking about the north pasture." She looked up at him with those green eyes and the quiet, interior smile. "I am thinking about the north pasture, and also about how the light is doing exactly what it did the first evening I sat here, and about how you planted roses before you had any certainty I would ever see them, and about how that was either a very foolish thing or a very brave thing, and I have decided it was both." He was quiet for a moment. "It was both," he agreed. She shifted Bernard slightly and turned to look at the roses, which were in their full June abundance now, the cream and the red and the pink climbing the trellis in a manner that was entirely uncontrolled and entirely right. "I stood here for a very long time that first morning," she said. "I stood in every room and I looked at the window light in the kitchen, and the way the fireplace was built, and the garden fence and the trellis you put up for the roses before the roses were there. And I thought about what kind of man does that. What kind of man builds something that's specific for a future he is not sure of? What did you conclude? He asked. I concluded, she said, that he was either the most reckless man I had ever met or the most faithful one. She looked at him. I decided to find out which. And, he said. Both of those too, she said, and he laughed, and she laughed, and Bernard made a small, disgruntled sound at being jostled and then settled again. And the evening kept doing what evenings in New Mexico do, which is to become more beautiful at every moment until the dark comes in and takes the beauty somewhere else for the night. The years that followed were the years of building, not just the house and the herd and the operation, but the life itself, the daily accumulating structure of two people who have chosen each other and keep choosing each other through the ordinary and the difficult and the surprising. There were difficult seasons. The summer of 1877 was brutal, a drought that hit everyone in the valley hard, and they lost 11 head of cattle to the heat and 2 weeks of near-dry creek before the rains came. They had enough saved, barely, to hold through it, and they made decisions together in those months with the same shared clarity they brought to everything. No recrimination, no second-guessing, just the facts of the situation and the best path through. There was a harder difficulty in 1878, when Opal lost a pregnancy at 4 months, quietly and with grief that she wore privately because that was her nature, but which Wallace saw and did not diminish by trying to fix or redirect, staying present in the simple and necessary way, making sure she knew she was not alone in the loss. She had cried only once in front of him, that winter evening in the parlor when Bernard was asleep, and he had held her and said nothing because there was nothing correct to say and she did not need correction. She needed the held. She recovered as she always recovered, not by forgetting but by placing the grief in its right size and proportion, holding it alongside everything else, continuing forward. That was Opal's particular strength. She could carry grief and still plant a garden. She could know loss and still calculate the spring fence budget. She was not hardened. She was seasoned, which is different, which is the quality of a person who has been through difficulty and come out understanding more about what matters. The following spring, 1879, their daughter arrived, Opal Callahan Quinn, who had her father's dark brown eyes and her mother's determined jaw, and who announced herself to the world with even more enthusiasm than her brother had managed. Bernard, 4 years old by then, regarded her with the grave assessment of a child who has had things entirely his own way for some time and is deciding how to feel about revision. He decided within a week to feel proprietary, which expressed itself as a constant and overbearing helpfulness toward his sister that Ida, from very early, indicated she did not particularly require. The house had grown by this time. Another room had been added in 1876, a proper study for Opal's accounts and correspondence, which had become more substantial as the operation grew. The original 2-room plan now extended to 5 rooms with the porch running the full front length of the house, and there was talk of adding a second story at some future point when it made sense, because the valley they lived in had changed. The silver mine had brought a railroad spur, and with the railroad had come more settlers and more commerce, and the beginnings of the kind of prosperity that was neither simple nor uncomplicated, but was undeniably present. Seco Hollow in 1880 was not the rough collection of boards and canvas it had been when Wallace rode in from Tennessee. It had a school, a proper one with a paid teacher, which Opal had been instrumental in establishing, writing letters to the territorial legislature and organizing the ranching families to fund the building. It had a second store and a doctor's office and a small hotel. The church had been rebuilt in adobe and stone and had a proper bell. The bent spur still stood, though it had somewhat gentled its character in deference to the families that now outnumbered the miners and drifters. Ed Foley was still in town, slower now in his movements but still precise in his work, and he had become something like a family fixture, appearing at the Quinn property for Sunday dinners with a frequency that suggested he was as much a part of the household as the furniture. He had built Bernard a small wooden horse at Christmas when the boy was 2, and for Ida he produced a set of building blocks that he had carved and smoothed himself, which she used to construct increasingly ambitious structures that she then knocked down with a satisfaction that seemed disproportionate to the construction, but was very Ida. Wallace was 41 in 1880 and Opal was 37, and they were, by the measure of the valley and the territory and by their own honest assessment, doing well. Not wealthy, but sound. The herd was strong. The land was producing. The water situation was managed. The children were healthy and bright and occasionally exhausting, and always, in the way of children who are genuinely loved and know it, in some fundamental way all right. He found her one evening in October of that year in the kitchen garden, the last of the season's harvesting done and the beds turned for winter, standing with her hands in the pockets of her coat and looking at the south wall of the house where the roses had died back for autumn, their bare canes tied neatly to the trellis. He came and stood beside her. "I was thinking about the first spring," she said. "Which first spring?" he asked, though he thought he knew. "The spring you showed up in this valley and helped me with a stuck wagon wheel and then spent 7 months pretending not to be in love with me," she said. "I was not pretending," he said mildly. "I was being patient." "You were being unreasonably patient," she said. "It made me nervous, as I believe I mentioned." "A pleasant kind of nervous," he quoted back at her. She turned and looked at him, and she was still, in 1880, in the early dusk of an October evening with the smell of turned earth around them, and the sound of Bernard and Ida engaged in some distant noisy dispute that would sort itself out, precisely the woman he had built a house for. Not because she was unchanged. She was not unchanged. The years had given her new lines and new knowledge and new depths. But because the thing that had struck him the first morning, the particular combination of capability and feeling and refusal to be defeated, that was exactly as present in her as it had ever been. "I want to tell you something," she said. "Tell me," he said. "That first morning," she said, "when I found the house. I stood in every room and I was very quiet for a very long time, and I know you were watching from the camp, and I know I did not give you much to go on, and I am sorry for that, because I think it must have been a difficult wait." "It was," he said honestly. "The reason I was so quiet," she said, "was that I was standing in the kitchen looking at the east window, and I was thinking that someone had built this window specifically so that the morning light would fall into the kitchen. And I realized that whoever had built it was thinking about someone being in this kitchen in the morning, and I realized that the someone was supposed to be me, and she paused. I had not been thought about that specifically in a very long time, since my father. And I was not sure how to hold it." He looked at her. The last of the light was going now, the sky a deep blue above the ridgelines. "How do you hold it now?" he asked. She turned to him fully and put her hand on his chest over his heart, which she sometimes did when words were the second best option. "Very well," she said. "I hold it very well." He covered her hand with his, and they stood in the October garden, while the evening came in around them, and the children's voices drifted from inside the house, and the rose canes were bare and resting, and would bloom again in June, the way they had every June of the 6 years since he had planted them, and the limestone walls of the house were warm even now with the day's stored heat, and the door he had ordered the iron handle for stood open, the light from inside falling across the porch boards. That was the year he had the roses replenished, adding 2 new varieties to the original 3, a deep burgundy that had not been available when he had first ordered from El Paso, and a climbing white rose that Opal had seen in a catalog and had mentioned once, casually, in the way she sometimes mentioned things she wanted without exactly asking for them. He had ordered them in August and planted them in October, and he did not tell her until they bloomed the following June, which they did with the same abundance as the originals, and she came around the corner of the house and stopped and looked at the south wall and said, "You added roses." "I did," he said. When did you plant them? October, he said. October, she repeated. You planted roses in October for June and did not mention it. I learned from your father, he said. A man should build a thing completely before he shows it to someone he loves. She looked at him for a long moment with the green eyes that had never once in 7 years lost the quality of assessment, the quality of a woman who needed and deserved evidence. Then she put her arms around his neck and kissed him in the June morning with the roses blooming behind her and the bees in the cottonwood grove already at their work. And Bernard and Ida were somewhere on the property being loud. And Conrad the mule, very old now but still present, was in the paddock. And Ed Foley was building something in the barn that they had not yet asked him to explain. And the house stood behind them with its door open and its windows full of light. That summer, Opal told him she thought they should consider taking in a child. She had heard of a boy of 7 living rough in town since the death of his parents to fever the previous winter, a quiet boy named Gabriel who had been passed between households without much thought given to his actual condition or future. She had been watching him for 2 months, she said, and he was capable and kind and completely alone in the way that could either make a person or break them, and she thought they had the house and the land and the life for it. Wallace asked her 2 questions. The first was whether she was sure. She said she was. The second was whether she had spoken to Gabriel. She said she had twice, and that he was a reader which he had not expected, that he carried a worn book in his coat pocket, and had been found by a reliable witness reading it behind the assay office in the rain. Then let us bring him home, Wallace said. Gabriel Callahan Quinn arrived at the limestone house in August with his worn book, which turned out to be an almanac of natural history, his small pack of belongings, and the defensive wariness of a child who has been disappointed enough times to require proof of safety before offering anything in return. He slept in the room off the kitchen, which had been built for storage, and which they converted over a weekend with a new bed and a shelf for his books and a hook for his coat. Bernard was 8 and large-spirited and adopted Gabriel as a brother with the same overbearing helpfulness he had directed at Ida, which Gabriel endured with more patience than Ida, possibly because he found it genuinely moving that anyone was trying so hard. Ida was 5 and regarded Gabriel with the assessing intelligence that she had inherited from her mother, but she shared her building blocks with him without being asked, which in Ida was a significant declaration. Gabriel bloomed slowly, in the way of plants that have had a hard start. He was reading to Bernard from the almanac before the end of September. He was helping Opal in the garden with a focused attention that made her tell Wallace, with real warmth, that the boy understood growing things the way some people understand language, intuitively and deeply. By Christmas, he had stopped sleeping with one ear open for disaster and started sleeping the deep sleep of a child who believes that morning will come and will be safe. On Christmas Eve, sitting in the parlor with the fire going and the children in a heap on the rug with the family dog, a brown hound named August who had shown up at the door in the fall and simply stayed, Wallace looked at Opal in the chair beside him with the knitting she rarely had time for but took up in December, and she looked back at him over the needles, and they did not need to say anything about what the room contained. By 1882, the valley had settled into a shape that would hold for a long time. The silver mine had played out, which took some pressure off the roads and the town, but the cattle industry was strong and the farms were producing, and Seco Hollow had become the kind of place that had been intended from the beginning without quite knowing it. The school that Opal had helped establish was graduating its first class of students, who had spent their full schooling years in the territory. Bernard was in that class, 11 years old and taller than the schoolteacher, who was a sharp-edged young woman from Ohio named Miss Pearl Haynes, who tolerated no nonsense and had very high standards, and whom Bernard regarded with the particular mix of fear and admiration that good teachers inspire. Gabriel was 10 and had developed into the boy that the almanac had promised, a careful observer of the natural world who could identify birds by their calls and knew the flowering schedule of every plant in the valley. He was going to be a naturalist, or perhaps a botanist, or perhaps simply the kind of person who knows a great deal about the world and is generous about sharing it. Opal taught him his mathematics and writing herself, because she thought the school teacher, excellent as she was, moved too quickly past the things that required patience, and because she found teaching him to be one of the particular pleasures of her days. Ida was 6 and already reading, which she had done by deciding at 4 that if Bernard could do it, she certainly could, and applying herself to the task with the focused intensity she brought to everything. She was also very interested in Opal's accounting books, which she had discovered were full of numbers arranged in patterns, and patterns, Ida had determined, were interesting. The house by 1882 had its second story, added the previous year, 2 rooms above the original structure with a low-ceilinged coziness that the children immediately claimed for sleeping in the summer when the ground floor was too warm. Wallace had built the staircase himself, taking 2 weeks longer than he had planned because he wanted the handrail to be exactly right, a curved piece of worked oak that fit the hand perfectly on the way up and down. Opal had run her hand along it when it was finished and said nothing, but nodded in the way that meant she had measured it against her standard and found it sufficient. The roses along the south wall had been climbing for 8 years by then, and had reached the second-story window on the right side, which was Ida's room in the summer, and she had a habit of reaching out the window in June and bringing a bloom inside to put in the small glass bottle she kept on her windowsill, which drove Opal to say every June that the roses should stay on the wall, and Ida to comply for approximately 3 days before the next bloom appeared in the bottle. It was the summer of 1882 that Consuela Montoya, who had remained Opal's friend through all the years, told them that she was considering leaving the territory for California, where her sister lived, and where she had been offered work as a teacher in a school that needed a Spanish language instructor. Opal received this news with the stillness of someone who understands that good decisions sometimes require loss on all sides. She said she was glad for Consuela. She also said she would miss her every day, and Consuela, who was a direct woman, said the same back. They threw Consuela a supper at the limestone house in August, the week before she left, and most of the town came, because Consuela had been woven into Seco Hollow's fabric for long enough that her going left a shape. The long table was set up on the front porch, and the summer evening was warm, and the roses were past their peak, but still present, and the food was extensive because Opal had been cooking for 3 days, and because the neighbors had all contributed their best dishes. At the end of the evening, Consuela sat with Opal and Wallace on the porch after the other guests had gone, and they talked about the years, what the valley had been and what it had become, what had been lost and what had been found. Consuela said, looking at the house and the garden and the roses, that she thought there were not many places in the territory where someone had built something this deliberately, where every part of it was chosen and intended. "He built it before I said yes," Opal said, and there was something in her voice that was not quite laughter and not quite wonder and was entirely particular to her. Consuela looked at Wallace. "I remember when she came home that first morning," she said. "She came to my house before she even went back to her own, and she sat at my table and she said, 'Consuela, a man has built a house for me and I do not know what to do with that.'" Wallace looked at Opal. Opal was looking at the roses with an expression he had spent 9 years learning to read. "You did not tell me you went to Consuela," he said. "I needed to think," she said. "What did Consuela say?" he asked. Consuela answered before Opal could. "I said, Opal Callahan, you have been managing everything alone for 2 years and you have gotten very good at it, but getting good at something does not mean you are required to do it alone forever." Opal looked at him then. "And I said I knew that," she said. "And I cried a little, which I did not enjoy, and Consuela gave me biscuits, and then I went home and thought about it for another 3 months. "I know," he said. "You are thorough." "I am," she agreed without apology. They walked Consuela to the road that night, and she hugged Opal for a long time and shook Wallace's hand and patted both children, who had stayed up past their bedtime for the occasion. And then she climbed into the wagon that would take her to the stage in town, and she was gone. And Seco Hollow was smaller for it, as places always are when the people who made them are no longer in them. The months that followed her departure were ordinary in the best sense, full of the particular texture of a life that has found its shape. The fall harvest, the cattle numbers, the children's schooling, the question of whether to add a second water trough in the south pasture, the small and medium difficulties of running a working property. These things filled the days with the kind of content that does not make for dramatic telling, but makes for a life that is actually being lived rather than merely anticipated. Wallace turned 43 in the fall of 1883, and Opal turned 39, and Bernard was 13, and Gabriel was 11, and Ida was 8, and August, the dog, was somewhere in the range of old and content. Ed Foley had slowed considerably, but still appeared on Sunday evenings, and had started teaching Bernard the fundamentals of carpentry, which the boy was discovering he had a natural hand for, which made Foley quietly pleased in the way of a man who sees his skills finding a future in someone else. It was that winter that Wallace sat one evening with Opal at the kitchen table, the children asleep, the fire warm, the accounts balanced and set aside, and he said to her, "I have been thinking about what we have made here." She looked at him over the candle. And I think it is something I could not have imagined when I rode into this valley," he said. "Not specifically. I could imagine land and a house and work that was mine. I could not imagine this." "This being what?" she asked in the tone of a woman who wants to hear the specific answer. "You," he said. "The children, the Sunday suppers, the bees, the roses, Gabriel knowing the name of every bird in the county, Ida doing sums in her sleep, which she does actually, I have heard her." He paused. "The particular way the house is in the morning when everyone is coming down, and it is loud and nothing has gone wrong yet, and the light is in the kitchen window." She was quiet for a moment, looking at the candle flame with those green eyes that he had spent 9 years and more looking at and never found any less interesting. "I stood in this kitchen," she said, "in November of 1874, and I looked at that window and I thought, someone put that window there for me. Someone built this whole thing with me in mind before they knew if I would want it." She looked at him. "Do you know what that is like? To be thought about that specifically before you have agreed to anything, to have someone make room for you in something they built before you arrived." "Tell me," he said. "It is the most frightening thing," she said, "and the most extraordinary thing. And I was very angry at you for a little while, because I had been doing perfectly well and you came and built a house, and now I could not stop thinking about window light." She smiled, the quiet interior smile that had been one of the great privileges of his life to know. "I have been grateful every day since." He reached across the table and she gave him her hand. They sat in the kitchen of the house he had built for her in a valley they had both chosen, and outside the frost was on the ground and the roses were sleeping and the stars were doing what stars do. "I think we should plant more roses in the spring," he said. She looked at him. "We already have 5 varieties." "There is room on the north wall," he said. A pause. "The north wall does not get as much sun." "The climbing varieties do not need as much," he said. "I looked into it." Another pause, longer. She was looking at him with the expression that he had eventually correctly identified as the face she made when she was trying not to be moved by something and failing. "You looked into it," she said. "I did," he said. "Last spring. I wrote to the nursery in El Paso." "You wrote to the nursery in El Paso last spring," she said, "about roses for the north wall." "I did, and said nothing. I was waiting for the right time to mention it." She looked at him for a long, quiet moment in the candlelight. Then she said, "You are still building things before you tell me." "Old habit," he said. She squeezed his hand and looked down at it and then back at him. And the candlelight was between them, and the house around them was everything they had made together, every room and every decision and every morning. and the children asleep above them who were the continuation of it all, and the dog at the fire, and the bees in the cottonwood grove, and the roses that bloomed every June without fail, faithful and extravagant and exactly what he had promised they would be. That long November morning, when she had stood before his open door in the pale gold light, and been silent for a very long time. "Plant the roses," she said. He planted them in April, when the ground softened and the valley was coming alive again in the particular way of a high desert spring, cautious and sudden, everything holding back and then all at once deciding to be present. He chose 2 climbing varieties for the north wall, one white and one a soft apricot that the catalog described as having an unusual fragrance. Gabriel helped him with the digging and the staking, narrating the approximate soil depth required and the spacing between plants with the authority of a boy who has read everything available on the subject. Bernard and Ida watched from the porch. Bernard with the mug of coffee that he had recently been allowed as a mark of near-adolescent status, and was drinking with the gravity appropriate to the occasion. Ida with a piece of paper and a pencil, apparently sketching the proceedings for reasons she did not explain, but which were clearly purposeful. Opal came out of the kitchen door and stood on the porch and watched them planting the roses, and she stood there in the April morning with the same quality of stillness she had had on the very first morning, the quality of a person who is taking in something larger than they can immediately process. She stood like that for a moment, and then she stepped off the porch and came and crouched beside Wallace in the garden bed and picked up a handful of the turned earth and let it fall between her fingers, the same gesture he had seen her make at the creek on that first day she came to look at his land. "Good soil," she said. "The best," he said. She stayed crouched beside him while he set the last plant in the ground and tamped the earth around the roots, and Gabriel staked the cane with precise and careful hands, and the morning light fell across the north wall of the house that Wallace Quinn had built for a woman who had not said yes yet, and who had stood silent for a very long time before she had known what to say, and who had been worth every plank and every stone and every nail and every moment of the long patient waiting. Bernard called from the porch that the coffee was getting cold, if anyone was interested. Ida called from her position of artistic observation that she was almost finished with her sketch, and everyone should hold still. August the dog came around the corner of the house and investigated the garden bed with professional thoroughness, before determining there was nothing edible and returning to the porch. Opal stood and brushed the soil from her hands and looked at the north wall where the new rose canes were staked and small and full of the years coming blooming, and then she looked at Wallace, who was still on one knee in the garden bed with mud on his hands and the April sun behind him. "Come inside," she said. "Bernard is right about the coffee." He stood. He put his muddy hand on her shoulder anyway, because he could, because it was his prerogative as the man who had built this house and planted these roses and chosen this particular valley and this particular woman. And she looked at his muddy hand on her coat and then at him and did not object, because it was her prerogative as the woman who had said yes when she was ready and not a moment before. They went inside. The door with the iron handle closed behind them. The April light on the north wall was modest and adequate. The roses would bloom by July. In the kitchen, Bernard poured coffee and Gabriel opened his almanac to a page on spring planting that he wanted to share, and Ida produced her sketch and showed it around the table with the proprietary satisfaction of an artist who has captured something and knows it. The sketch was of Wallace and Opal and Gabriel in the garden with the north wall behind them, and it was done with a careful eye and a sure hand that was very like the hand that had drawn the rosebush in bloom that hung on the kitchen wall, the one Opal's mother had drawn, the one that Opal had brought from the adobe house and placed exactly where the morning light could find it. Opal looked at Ida's sketch for a long time. She looked at the garden and the figures and the wall that would have roses on it by summer. She looked at her daughter, who had her father's eyes and her mother's jaw and her own particular and complete self, who had been born in the house that was built before a yes was given, who had never known a morning when the limestone walls and the kitchen window and the smell of the roses in June were not the facts of home. "It is very good," Opal said. Ida said, "I know," without false modesty, which was entirely Ida, and put the sketch on the table between her and Gabriel, who considered it seriously and agreed. Wallace looked across the table at Opal and she looked at him, and there was between them the look of two people who have built something together and know what it is worth because they know what went into it, every day and every season and every difficulty and every morning of light in the kitchen window. "What do you want to do today?" he said. She considered. "Check the fence on the east boundary," she said. "Then the accounting. Then I want to walk the creek before supper." "I will come with you," he said. "To the creek? I know you will," she said. And that was that, and it was everything. And the house stood on its 60 acres in the valley of Seco Hollow, New Mexico, in the spring of 1884, with its limestone walls and its oak handrail and its root cellar and its kitchen window facing east. And along the south wall the roses were budding early that year, which was a good sign, which meant the summer would be warm and long. And along the north wall the new canes were putting out their first green leaves, reaching toward whatever sun the year intended to give them, which is what roses do when they are well planted and properly tended, which is what everything does, given the right ground and enough time.